Okay, everybody. So we're picking back up on where I was talking about before. So um, again, this whole idea of um, behavioral neuroscience picks up on how the different parts of the brain are interconnected and how um, the so behavioral neuroscience focuses on clinical neuropsychology tends to focus on localization. And the criticism of neuropsychology is that clinical neuro is it can be reductionist. It doesn't really allow for the acceptance of how complex human behavior can be. And we talked about the PAG area. One other thing I wanted to mention about the PAG area and the brainstem, well, particularly the brainstem, is and this sort of ties it back to some of the stuff, some of the major issues we've been talking about. So you have the brainstem, which one which has to do the brainstem, which relates to needs and triggering the needs and triggering the sort of indication that there's a need that needs to be met, would be other words. One thing to keep in mind is that there is this upper part of the brainstem uh, that is sort of seen as the upper brainstem is sort of is seen as the base of consciousness. This uh, the upper brainstem is connected to our um, being aware of our state of being. Um, and so, what's interesting to keep in mind about this is if we see how the brainstem is connected to consciousness or awareness of being aware, and is connected directly to this whole idea of uh, recognizing bodily needs in sort of the center where these bodily needs come from. Uh, in a lot of so from a theoretical standpoint, it's really seen as that is probably the area that we could be said to be associated with the id in Freud's id, ego, superego, and the cortical structures, the hypothalamus, the different parts of our brain that help us process information. That's the ego. That's where the center of um, so the cortical, so the brainstem, sort of this basic level. Um, the brainstem, particularly the upper brainstem, is where the id could be seen to be located, and the cortical part, the sort of the different lobes, that's where the ego is. Now, also incorporated within the ego, and this is more up in the air, is where exactly the superego is located, the understanding of rules and uh, so basically the ego and the superego are seen as being combined in the rest of the brain, but the cortical structures, the higher levels of functioning, which are seen in the outer layers of the brain, the lobes, the prefrontal cortex, the frontal cortex, the hypothalamus, all of those are seen as the areas where the ego um, resides. So the id is seen in the brainstem. The ego is seen in the higher levels of functioning, the cortical areas of functioning. And then as we move on, so one thing I want you to understand about this is it's basically addressing this idea that there is a part of the brain that develops uh, right as the individual is born, where our drives and our motivations for doing things that we end up doing from the moment we're born, and that's seen as being in the brain stem. And then later on, the development of language, so all the areas are kind of where language is developed and rule bearing, like Wernicke's area, Broca's area, those parts of the brain are often where um, we store rules of language, we store rules of social behavior, and then the other areas of the brain, the higher levels, the frontal cortex, the lobes, those areas of the brain, uh, those are all seen as where the ego resides, where our that kind of sort of ties everything together. Exactly where the superego and ego reside, that's not as clear cut. But what is clear cut is, in the end, the ego resides squarely in the higher areas of functioning, the higher areas of the brain, the cortical areas. So that and what I want you to understand here is when we talk about the um, uh, conscious and the unconscious, one of the big distinctions made in the neurological literature between the two is the unconscious is where the stuff is that we don't have language for, that we don't use words for. It's there, but we don't exactly have a way of verbalizing it. And again, what therapy then becomes is this idea of taking what is conscious, what we don't have words for, and giving it language, giving it words, bringing it into that area where we not only can see it, but we can verbalize what exactly is going on. Okay, so we take then how there's this um, so what's happening within the um, within the brain is that, like I said, there's this unconscious where we don't have uh, where where we don't have words, but we're still motivated by drives and instincts, uh, even if we don't have words for exactly what it is we're trying to do. So now one thing I want you to keep in mind is notice sort of how this is all connecting. There's this idea that the parts of the brain that try to maintain homeostasis are the same, whether the homeostasis relates to how much salt is in the body or how much, fluid is in different parts of the lung or bile in the gallbladder or anything like that. It's the same part of the system that relates to whether there is too much uh, activity going on in the amygdala, which would reflect a high level of negative emotions, or whether the PAG system is being overexcited. Um, so the area of the brain that says, "Hey, homeostasis," this whole hypothalamus brainstem interaction, that would be the same regardless of what's causing it. Now, what you bring in for a lot of the affective, a lot of emotional stuff is the limbic system, the amygdala, the limbic it is also within this limbic system that really relates to the emotion. So the part that triggers that area when there is emotional stuff going on is the limbic system. And um, you can see in the article on Lacan that there is they lay out 7 different types of instincts: emotional instincts, affective instincts is the same as emotional instincts. These sort of more specific um, pathways in the brain that are triggered when we have certain emotional experiences. Now, one difference between these affective um, pathways in the brain that relate to emotions and some other pathways in the brain that relate to other experiences is it's more flexible in terms of what can bring about um, a feeling of being back at homeostasis. If you're triggering uh, the brainstem as far as needing to have certain uh, drives met or certain instinct, if if that part of the brainstem is being triggered that shows that, hey, there's this need that's not being met, and it relates to thirst, which is a physiological, purely a physiological pathway, then the only thing that's really going to help is water or some sort of liquid. Well, maybe not just water. I mean, there's other types of liquid, but mainly liquid. Water primarily is what's going to meet that need. But as far as these affective pathways in the limbic system that are triggering a need to be met, those can be satisfied with a lot of different things. So that's why there's a lot of flexibility in terms of the person learning different ways of handling this feeling of things being off, this feeling of not being in homeostasis, because they tend to be more flexible than some of the other pathways. One other thing, and I'm bringing this up, I'm reading this directly from the article. Um, these affective instincts and these affective pathways, um, uh, some of them may be activated even uh, before the person may be able to learn uh, what it is that's causing the difference. So again, we get to this idea that uh, that developing a sense that something needs to be done in order for a need to be met. Um, that that pathway of learning that something needs to be done in order for a need to be met that's been triggered by affect and emotions, that's present in newborns. That is what is called procedural memory, as you may talk about before. Um, and one area for procedural memory is the basal ganglia, BASALGANGLIA, and that develops very early. That develops in infancy. But the episodic memory, where you sort of, even if you can't use words, you at least get sort of a snapshot, a picture of what's leading to the difficulty. That doesn't develop till around the age of 3. So a lot of time, so what you have here is the individual can learn um, that something needs to be done about a certain situation, even if they are incapable of actually remembering what it was that led to that feeling. So really, and you know, you may remember my talking about the differences between those two types of memories earlier. Really, what you start to have here is the person develops this strong sense that something needs to be done in order to meet a need that they have internally, even if they have not been able to recall what led to that happening. And that is why, and I'll finish up here, but that is why, you know, across the board, regardless of what theoretical school is followed, this idea that the first 3 years of life are particularly important for developing a person's personality and their view of the world. Because a lot of times they are developing this sense of how they're interacting with the world, but they don't really have any memory of how they came across to have that view of the world. And so a lot of times later on, if someone is facing difficulties, especially if they've faced trauma very early in their life, it is a matter of overcoming a process, as procedure that has been recalled for how certain problematic situations need to be handled, even if the person is incapable of remembering what led to that. So I think that, you know, this difference between procedural memory and episodic memory, this difference between um, procedural memory, learning what needs to be done, which is located in different areas, but particularly the basal ganglia, that develops early on. But the episodic representative memory, where the person remembers specifics about what happened. That doesn't develop till age 3. So there's a lot of this material that gets stored up to the age 3 that's there, that's impacting the person that's impacting the person, but almost by definition, um, is impacting them on a non-conscious level because they have no language for it. They don't even specifically remember what happened. And it lays the basis for how we function. And it's also why, Lacan says that the brain itself isn't particularly adaptable, that the mind is, but the brain isn't, because the brain has sort of this foundation that's laid early on while all the parts are developing. But once all the parts are developed, there's information now in there because of what's happened during the first years of development that the person may not quite know what to do with. Now, if they are developed in a healthy environment and they continue to be in a healthy development, it just goes along on a normal path. The brain adapts. And what I mean, the mind helps the brain adapt. The brain as is isn't very adaptable, but when you enter into the mind, this interconnection of the different parts, you have the neural traces, you have the plasticity, that all helps the brain change as a way of interacting with the world around the person. But if the person has established a very negative view of the world, a problematic way of interacting with the world, a sort of overemphasis on there being things to worry about and be concerned about, that then leads to difficulties later on, that difficulties that may need to be brought into consciousness and may need to be addressed in a way that the person has helped to recognize that there's a problem there, but may not be able to say exactly why the problem's there or how it came about. Okay, I think that's enough for now. We'll pick this up when we meet on Thursday. And just as a reminder, everything covered up through this next class when we meet live could be on the next exam, which you will have not this upcoming class, but the next class. Okay, I'll see you all on Thursday.